Energy Outlook to 2035, and that's available free of charge on the BP website, forecasts that global energy consumption is expected to rise by 41% from 2012 to 2035, compared to a 55% increase in the previous 23 years. 95% of that growth is going to come from Eastern economies, from developing economies mainly in India and China. Shares of the major fossil fuels are converging, with oil, natural gas, and coal each expected to make up around 25% of the global energy mix by the year 2035. The growth in demand for energy is being driven from the East, while the growth in supply, amazingly, is being driven from the West. 40 years ago, Dr. Eric Williams, our country's first prime minister, he gave 3 speeches and the themes of those speeches were the energy crisis in the world. That was around the time, 40 years ago, 1974, of the Arab oil embargo, where Arab oil-producing countries embargoed oil supply to the Western world. At that time, the prevailing global energy equation was in reverse. Growth in supply was coming from the East, and growth in demand was coming from the West. So in that 40-year period, the world has changed. The world population has also eclipsed 7 billion human beings in 2011. Earlier in that same year, China became the world's second largest economy. The United States still, however, remains the world's largest economy, and by some distance. In 2012, the World Bank reported the USA's GDP at $16.2 trillion US dollars versus China's GDP of 8.3 trillion. And when you take into account that China has 5 times more people than the United States, it becomes even a bigger gap. It is my view that the shale revolution in the United States means that the autumn of the American empire has been postponed. The term American empire, in case it's attributed to me, was borrowed from Oxford historian Neil Ferguson. In early 1974, as I said, the world was reeling from the Arab oil embargo of the Western world, which sent oil prices spiraling upward and ushered into a period that we call in Trinidad and Tobago here the oil boom. In response to the Arab oil embargo, President Nixon launched an initiative called Project Independence. Its goal, to make America energy independent by 1980. Of course, it was a failure. America did not become energy independent by 1980. They simply became more dependent on importing oil. Fast forward to the year 2014, and according to this gentleman here, Daniel Yergin, writing in Politico, he says America is on the verge of achieving energy independence, and this is being achieved not through energy conservation or wind or nuclear. It is being achieved through the commercial exploitation of shale oil and shale gas. To illustrate his point, in the year 2005, the United States was importing 60% of its crude oil. And by the year 2013, that number collapsed to 35%. And this is a graph showing net energy imports in 2013 in the United States, the lowest in more than 20 years, showing the time series being 1985 to 2012, showing that America is importing less and less energy. So that is the world we live in, and that is the reality. We have no control over what is happening with the shale revolution in the United States. And moving a bit forward again with Mr. Yergin, speaking to McKinsey only a few days ago, Mr. Yergin, who is the author of 2 very famous books. I sell a lot of books for Mr. Yergin. We've actually spoken and invited him to Trinidad, and he wasn't prepared to give a discount. In speaking to McKinsey recently, Mr. Yergin says, and I read what he says, the unconventional oil and gas revolution, shale gas, and what's become known as tight oil, is the most important energy innovation so far in the 21st century. I say so far because we can be confident that there will be other innovations coming down the road. There's more emphasis on energy innovation than ever before, and that speaks to what this business school is doing. unconventional oil and gas came as a pretty big surprise. It even took the oil industry by surprise. Peak oil, and I spoke about peak oil before, peak oil was such a fervent view 5 or 6 years ago when oil prices were going up. And he continues, when you have a lot of bright people working on a problem in a sustained way, you will probably get to a solution. Will it be 5 years or 15 years? We don't know. But ultimately, need drives innovation. Need drives innovation. I see this as all part of the great revolution that began with the steam engine, and there's no reason to think it's going to end. It's going to continue in the oil and gas industry, and it's also going to stimulate innovations of other kinds among renewables and alternatives. A second view expressed in McKinsey this week is that of Fred Kropp, who is the head of the Environmental Defense Fund. And he says, 10 years from now, what I see is an internet-connected world where the behaviors of companies, including how products have been produced, are so transparent that those businesses who are truly good citizens will be rewarded in the marketplace. These two thinkers have, in a way, framed the issues of energy and sustainable development. And of course, if you step outside, you would see that mind map. That's what I call it, Professor Kirillo, the mind map outside, showing you the future. Again, writing in Politico in November 2013, Jürgen further crystallizes the US energy boom by adding that while it isn't likely that the United States would actually become energy independent in the foreseeable future, it will become a lot less dependent on importing energy. And this is the graph here showing US crude oil reserves at the start of 2013, reaching the highest levels since 1976. And you can see the very sharp upward movement from 2008. And that's what's been happening in the United States. Let's look a bit at what's happening in East Africa. In East Africa, Anadarko, ENI, Statoil, and BG have made huge gas discoveries in Tanzania and Mozambique. In fact, one of our nationals is out there assisting in the development of that, Derek Hudson of BG. In an article in the Financial Times, March 18, 2013, it was reported that the waters of Mozambique and Tanzania have turned into one of the hottest frontiers in the global gas and oil industry. By the end of 2013, Anadarko would have invested $3 billion in its discoveries off the coast of Mozambique, which have between 35 and 65 trillion cubic feet of estimated recoverable reserves in a block known as Area 1. And the article goes on to say that the combined potential of Mozambique and Tanzania is somewhere in the region of 200 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And the article goes on to say that such a reserve of natural gas could support as many as 20 LNG trains, each one costing $7 billion US. So there is a boom in natural gas taking place in East Africa, and in which Trinidadians are actually involved. The other issue from a global perspective is one which is beginning to pick up some attention in Trinidad, and that's the Panama Canal expansion. The expanded locks of the Panama Canal, what's being expanded is not the canal itself, it's the locks of the canal. The expanded locks of the Panama Canal will be able to handle ships as long as 1,200 feet and as wide as 160 feet, compared with the current size, 965 feet and 106 feet wide. What does that mean? It means that at present, only 4% of the world's 369 LNG tankers can fit through the Panama Canal. And just 6 LNG tankers have entered the canal in the last 5 years. And that's according to IHS Marine. The new canal with the expanded locks will be able to accommodate 89% of the world's LNG tankers. And that has a big implication for the trade in liquefied natural gas between Trinidad and Tobago and the Pacific Basin, and the trade in LNG between Australia and the Atlantic Basin. I turn a bit to nuclear power. Nuclear energy is used to generate 11% of the world's electricity with no greenhouse gas emissions. And that sounds like a pretty good deal until you consider the risk associated with nuclear energy. In 2011, There was, of course, the tsunami in Japan, and consequently the Fukushima disaster, which dealt a huge blow to the image of nuclear power globally. Japan imports, and we were in Japan last November, Japan imports 84% of its energy requirements. The country's 50-plus main reactors provide 30% of that country's electricity, and that was expected to creep up to 40% by the year 2017. The prospect now is for at least half of this from a depleted fleet of no more than 48 reactors. Only yesterday, the Japanese cabinet approved an emergency energy policy reversing the previous government's plans to gradually mothball nuclear power plants, but there remains serious opposition to nuclear power in Japan. In the year 2012, following the Fukushima disaster, the German government took a decision to phase out nuclear power by the year 2020. So it seems that to the year 2025, which we're trying to look at, the expansion of nuclear power will be limited. It may actually go in reverse. And therefore, there's a big question over the future of nuclear power in the world. And in again, looking at the global perspective, before I go into the industry locally, mention must be made of Mexico. Mexico, in the context of the hemisphere, deserves special attention at this point in time. Only a few months ago, that country's government voted to open up Mexico's oil industry. The nationalization of the Mexican oil industry, and I think it was the year 1938, the nationalization of the Mexican oil industry in the year 1938, which is actually the PhD thesis of Professor Anthony Bryan, who was based on the nationalization of the Mexican oil industry, was celebrated as a public holiday in Mexico. They were so proud of the nationalization of the Mexican oil industry. The new president of Mexico has decided to open up Mexico's oil industry to foreign direct investment. That means, what does that mean for us? It means that Mexico will now become a major competitor to Trinidad and Tobago for foreign direct investment. We already compete, as you know, with Colombia for foreign direct investment in this hemisphere. So I turn now a bit to our own industry here locally. And this is a graph of our historical oil and gas production. Those of you all who go to many of the energy conferences in Port of Spain, you would have seen this graph many times. And the green in the graph is oil production, and the red in the graph is natural gas production. And to the extreme right, that is not a tsunami, that is the natural gas production of this country starting to kick off exponentially around the end of the last century, around 1999. And there's a good reason for that. That's the year we shipped our first cargo of liquefied natural gas. And at the very top there, it begins to plateau out. The peak in the green graph is the year 1978, and that represents the peak of oil production coming from the teak, salmon, and poi fields off the East Coast. So that's our industry over the period 1908 to 2012. We've been producing hydrocarbons in this country for 106 years. The petroleum resources, and this is the boring part, the geologists in the audience will stay awake, and everybody else will go to sleep, right? Suki will stay awake, right? The petroleum resources of Trinidad and Tobago have been generated in rocks which are of a similar type to those of Venezuela and Colombia. These rocks are overlain by thick successions of deep-water sediments, which form the basis of reservoir traps and seals that are necessary for the oil and gas accumulations in our country, the source rock of which is the Cretaceous. And for the non-geologists in the room, a good example of the Cretaceous in Trinidad and Tobago is the San Fernando Hill, which is considered to be a natural Cretaceous outcrop. So you could see the Cretaceous by looking at the San Fernando Hill. There are 5 major, and I'll just skip some of my graphs here. There are 5 major producing regions from which exploration and production has been occurring since 1857. And they are the Southern Basin, the Central Range, and its extension offshore, the Darien Ridge, the Northern Caroni Basin and its offshore extension into the Gulf of Paria, as well as the Carapano Basin, and in the eastern offshore area, the Columbus Basin, which is probably the most prolific area. I tend to refer to the Carapano Basin as the Tobago Trough. Geologists, please tell me if I'm wrong, as the Tobago Trough area. The prognosis for the marine frontier area offshore eastern Trinidad is favorable. Several prospects have been identified by DGA in the analysis of the deep marine basin with potential in the order of thousands of square kilometers of aerial extent. And this is sort of what the DGA work turned up. And you see lead 40, lead 30, lead 20. And that's all in the deep water. And we'll talk a bit about the deep water. I see representatives of BHP here. Additionally, putting the deep water aside, and that's based on 2D seismic there, and BHP will acquire better quality seismic. Additionally, there continues to be, and let me just go back. Additionally, there continues to be exploration activity in already developed basins. The recently acquired seismic survey by BP in the Columbus Basin being case in point. That is currently being analyzed and processed, and we are all very, very optimistic based on the preliminary results that we have been getting. But as Norman would tell you, the application of new technology to an old basin always yields results all over the world. So this is BP now investing in new technology in an old basin. As these areas receive renewed attention, other regions are not forgotten. The BHP Angostura oil discovery in 1999 has caused attention to be targeted on other similar play concepts along that trend, and there are those who believe that trend extends all the way up into Barbados, which is good news for the Bajans, right? While future exploration effort is focused in the deep water region to the extreme eastern offshore, there is as well potential for new oil discoveries on land and in the Gulf of Paria. Despite the presence of mature fields on land, there is still the possibility of undiscovered petroleum resources in deeper horizons below 5,000 feet in the central and southern basins. In fact, the ministry's records show that most of the exploration on land in Trinidad has not gone below 6,000 feet. It is for that reason the ministry has incentivized deep horizon drilling, that is, drilling deeper. Ongoing seismic data acquisition and planned gravity and magnetic surveying are important. Substantial heavy oil resources under the operatorship of Petrotrin have been identified both offshore and off the southwestern coast of Trinidad. These resources are in different stages of development. In a 2010 paper by Professor Richard Daw, who has now gone back to the UK, Rafi Hussain and Wayne Bertrand, entitled Trinidad and Tobago Heavy Oil Recovery, it was estimated that this country has approximately 8 billion barrels of heavy oil, defined as oil initially in place. That's not recoverable. So if we apply a 10% recoverability factor to that 8 billion, that is 800 million barrels of oil, which is a tremendous resource that we have not even started to properly exploit. So I'll talk a bit about the fiscal regime now. The upstream sector is the main pillar of the energy sector and accounts for about 60% of the value generated by the energy sector. It is what I call the engine of the engine. That's the upstream. In 2010, according to central bank data, foreign direct investment in Trinidad and Tobago was approximately, this is into Trinidad and Tobago's energy sector, and you have to forgive me as I find these graphs. Right, this is foreign direct investment into the petroleum sector. By petroleum, we mean oil and gas. You see a sharp jump in FDI in the year 2011, and it continues into the year 2012. Central Bank has not been able to give me 2013 figures yet, but I'm working on that, getting me 2013 figures. But 2013 figures not being available, the Ministry of Energy puts out a questionnaire to all major companies operating in Trinidad, asking them to indicate what is their capital expenditure profile going out into the future. But that's what we're here to talk about, the future. So in 2014, capital expenditure forecasted for the energy sector is US $3.3 billion. In 2015, that figure is 3.2 billion. And in 2016, it is somewhere like around close to 3 billion US dollars. The main actors in these numbers, the main spenders for the next 3 years, are really 3 companies: BP, BG, and Petrotrin. That's when we analyze that data that we got back from the companies. Most of that money is being spent in the upstream. It's being spent to bring oil and natural gas to the surface and to bring it to market in a safe and efficient manner. So we've had a big increase in foreign direct investment. In the past 4 years, there have been no new taxes imposed on companies in the energy sector. That has allowed those companies to operate in an environment of certainty. Companies like to, of course, feel that the rug is not going to be pulled from under them at any given time. In the last 4 years, we have simplified the competitive bidding process. The result is that we have signed 7 deepwater production sharing contracts, 5 shallow average depth water production sharing contracts, and we've granted 2 licenses to Petrotrin, one for the Trinmar acreage and the other one for the North Marine acreage. This year, we expect to sign 2 more deepwater production sharing contracts and 3 onshore licenses with Range Resources, territorial, and lease operators. There are currently, ladies and gentlemen, 28 active production sharing contracts in Trinidad and Tobago. One of them is the Block 6 production sharing contract, and that dates back to the year 1974. Of these 28 active production sharing contracts, 12 have been signed in the last 4 years. And that's a great accomplishment by the ministry. The role of the PSC as a mechanism to capture value in this country is something that has to be explored by the economists at the University of the West Indies, because increasingly, when you look at the draft, at the estimates of revenue for the country, and that's what we call the yellow books. Mr. Endel, I'm sure you know the yellow books very well. What we call the yellow books, we are seeing that the revenue profile in the energy sector is shifting away from the exploration and production licenses and towards the production sharing contracts. So that's the mechanism that we have chosen to go with in the main since 1974. Under the previous version of production sharing contracts, and this has to do with the marketing of hydrocarbon, because the production sharing contract is based on the concept of the minister's share and the company's share. Well, nobody pulls up in front of the ministry with a truck full of oil and said, "Minister, here's your share." Okay? That's not how it works. We get a check that is commensurate with the value of the minister's share of oil or natural gas. So under previous versions of production sharing contracts, the companies were given, that's the contractor was given primary responsibility for developing markets for available natural gas and negotiating on a joint dedicated basis for the sale of that natural gas. That is no longer the case. The new production sharing contracts that we've signed over the last 3 years now gives the minister, and by minister we really mean the ministry, a greater range of options. So what does that mean? It means that the minister or the ministry could now get into the business of directly marketing oil or natural gas. And we think that's the way the country has to go. The government has to get more involved in the marketing of oil and natural gas. The changes in the fiscal regime have been progressive and have been recognized, and it recognizes that we compete internationally for capital. Capital, ladies and gentlemen, as I keep saying, is not obliged to come here. Capital, if we don't compete for it, if we don't position ourselves for it, will go to Colombia, it will go to Mexico, or it could go to Ghana. So we have to continually be competitive. As a consequence, government has made a number of progressive changes to the fiscal regime in the last 4 years, and even before that, when Minister Endel was in office, that work had started at the Ministry of Energy. And I counted 11 major changes that have been made over the last 4 years, and I'll just mention a couple of them, some of the more significant ones. We have changed the rate of cost recovery to better reflect international best practice and the risk profile out in the shallow, average, and deep depths of water. We've reduced the petroleum profits tax for deep water exploration and development. We've simplified the supplemental tax, SPT, supplemental petroleum tax regime. There's been a harmonization of the SPT regime. There used to be two rates for marine. One was 33% and one was 42%. And the rate that you had to pay depended on the year that your license was signed. There was a pre-88 rate and a post-88 rate, and we thought that that was very cumbersome and difficult to manage, and in some cases it was unfair, so it's now one rate, 33%. Incentives have been provided for small marine and mature marine fields. Investment tax credits have been provided for enhanced oil recovery. There's been the allowance for sub-licensing in marine areas. We've introduced a special SPT rate for new field development. We've introduced incentives for deep horizon drilling on land and in marine area. And the big one, which was passed in Parliament, I think it was last week, Tuesday, is the restructuring of the capital allowances for exploration, development, workovers, and compression projects. And that simply means that we have put in place a mechanism now for companies operating under exploration and production licenses to recover their capital expenditure faster. So let's have a look at some of the graphs